I never expected to catch him the way I did. Not because I trusted him blindly, but because betrayal always feels like something that happens to other people until the moment it knocks the air out of your own lungs. That evening had started so ordinarily, so harmlessly, that it felt cruel in hindsight. I had finished work late, my head still buzzing with deadlines and emails, and decided on a whim to surprise him at the lounge where he said he'd be meeting a client. The place was crowded, warm with music and laughter, the kind of setting where faces blur together under soft lights. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything, but first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. Now let's get into the details of the story. I spotted him almost immediately, not because I was searching desperately, but because my eyes instinctively knew where to land. And there he was, leaning in too close to a woman I had never seen before, his hand resting where familiarity shouldn't have existed. The shock didn't scream inside me. It went quiet first, the way the world goes silent right before something shatters. For a few seconds I truly believed my mind was misinterpreting the scene. That's what denial does. It buys time by pretending nothing is wrong. I stood frozen near the entrance, gripping my bag strap so tightly my knuckles turned pale, watching him laugh in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. He looked relaxed, unguarded, intimate. The woman leaned toward him as if the space between them belonged exclusively to them. Then he kissed her, not a rushed mistake, not an awkward pullback, but a deliberate, familiar kiss that erased every last excuse I might have given him. My chest tightened so violently I thought I might collapse right there between strangers who had no idea my life had just cracked open. It felt unreal, like I was watching a scene meant for someone else's tragedy, not my own. Anger didn't come first. What came first was humiliation. The awareness that I was standing in the same room as my own replacement without having been formally dismissed from the role. That people were laughing, drinking, celebrating around us while I was quietly being erased in real time. I wanted to scream his name, to demand an explanation that didn't deserve to exist, but my voice stayed trapped behind the wall of disbelief. Instead, I watched as they separated, both smiling, and that smile did something permanent to me. It wasn't just that he had cheated. It was that he looked happy doing it. The version of him that belonged to me had apparently been borrowed, copied, and handed to someone else without announcement. That realization stung deeper than any words ever could. I don't remember how I moved after that, only that suddenly I was in front of them, the crowd's noise lowering into a distant hum as if the room itself had leaned in to listen. His face drained of color when he saw me. The woman stiffened, confusion flashing across her features as the reality of the triangle formed too quickly for comfort. I didn't accuse him at first. I asked one simple question in a voice that didn't sound like mine at all. How long? He stuttered, his mouth opening and closing around words that refused to line up properly. The woman's eyes widened, then narrowed. Understanding passed between us without a single sentence being fully formed. It was in that instant, standing in front of strangers, dignity unraveling in public, that something inside me snapped, not with rage but with clarity. I walked away from them before he could gather himself enough to lie convincingly. Each step felt heavy, as if the floor was tilting under my feet. I pushed through the crowd toward the bar just to anchor myself to something solid, anything that wasn't the image of his mouth on someone else's lips. My hands trembled as I asked for a drink I didn't even want. My reflection in the mirror behind the bar startled me. Eyes too bright, face too still, heartbreak wearing the disguise of composure. This was not how I imagined discovering infidelity. It wasn't a confession or a phone left unlocked. It was a public undoing designed by coincidence and cruelty. And standing there in that moment, I felt judged by every unfamiliar face, even though none of them knew my story. That's when I noticed him for the first time. The stranger seated just a few stools away, quietly watching the room with a kind of calm attention that felt almost untouched by the noise. He wasn't staring at me, not at first. He was simply present in a way that felt grounded, steady, and dangerously out of place in a room charged with impulse and spectacle. He looked up as I took my drink, our eyes meeting briefly in a collision that should have meant nothing. Yet somehow it did. There was no flirtation in that glance, no invitation. Just recognition, as if he could read the fracture running through me without me having to explain a single detail. I looked away immediately, embarrassed by the vulnerability I feared he had just witnessed. Behind me, I could hear my ex's voice rising as he tried to explain himself to the woman he'd been caught with, and I knew the story would soon reach me whether I wanted it to or not. My chest tightened again, but this time something else mixed with the pain: defiance. I had spent so long trying to be understanding, patient, reasonable, that my own anger had learned to whisper instead of roar. But that night the whisper was gone. I did not want to be the graceful, wounded woman who left quietly while he rewrote the narrative behind her. I did not want pity. I wanted him to feel, even for a second, the shock I was still drowning in. And as I stood there at the bar with a stranger's quiet presence at my side, a reckless thought began to take shape in the space where my restraint had finally burned away. I turned back toward the room, not toward my ex this time, but toward the man who had unknowingly become the closest thing to stillness in my storm. I studied him openly now, taking in his steady posture, the lack of calculation in his expression. He wasn't performing for anyone. He wasn't posturing. He simply existed, unbothered by the chaos that had consumed me. And in that contrast, something dangerous bloomed. A decision not born of desire, but of wounded pride and aching defiance. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his story. All I knew was that my heart had just been broken in public, and for the first time in my life, I felt ready to be the author of the next moment instead of its victim. I don't remember deciding to walk toward him so much as I remember realizing I already had. My body moved with a certainty my mind had not yet caught up with, carrying me across the narrow space between us as the noise of the lounge blurred into a distant vibration. Every step felt illegal somehow, charged with consequence I refused to fully calculate. The stranger looked up as I approached, surprise flickering across his face for only a second before settling into quiet curiosity. I stopped in front of him without a word, my pulse drumming so loudly in my ears that I was sure he could hear it. For one suspended moment, neither of us spoke. I saw questions in his eyes, but also something else: attention without judgment. And in that fragile, breathless pause, the entire weight of humiliation I had carried since seeing my ex with that woman compressed into a single reckless intention. I leaned forward and kissed him. The act itself was softer than the storm that led to it. There was no hunger in it, no practiced seduction, just the raw collision of shattered pride and borrowed courage. His lips were warm, unresisting for a fraction of a second before surprise rippled through his body. I felt the hesitation as clearly as I felt his breath catch, yet he did not immediately pull away. The room seemed to gasp around us, the sudden break in background noise registering at the edges of my awareness. For those few seconds I was not the woman who had just been betrayed. I was the woman who had chosen the next move. And that illusion of control was intoxicating in a way I had never known before. When I finally pulled back, the stranger looked at me with wide eyes, confusion battling with something unreadable beneath the surface. I murmured a single apology that barely escaped my lips, not loud enough for anyone else to catch. Before he could respond, I turned sharply and faced the room. The silence was no longer subtle. Heads had turned. Conversations had stopped. And my ex, who only minutes earlier had been trying to explain himself to the woman in his arms, now stood frozen several feet away, staring at me as if I had struck him. The shock on his face was undeniable. For the first time that night he looked as powerless as I had felt when I first walked into the lounge. The irony landed with a quiet cruelty I did not resist. His mouth opened as if to speak, but the words refused to form. The woman beside him stepped back slightly, her earlier confidence replaced by unease as the dynamics in the room shifted without her consent. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, strangers suddenly drawn into a story they did not understand but would quietly rewrite by the end of the evening. My heart raced as I held my ground in the center of it all, refusing to look away from my ex's stunned expression. In that moment I did not feel victorious. I felt exposed, trembling at the edge of something irreversible. But I also felt seen, not as the wronged woman left behind, but as the one who had taken the narrative out of silence and flung it into light. I turned back to the stranger instinctively, as if seeking confirmation that the moment had actually happened. He had risen halfway from his stool now, one hand resting on the bar for balance. Our eyes locked again, and this time, there was no confusion in his. There was curiosity sharpened by recognition, as if he now understood the role he had accidentally been assigned in a drama neither of us had rehearsed. He did not say my name because he did not know it. He did not demand explanation. Instead, he studied me with a steadiness that unnerved me more than outrage ever could. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough not to reach beyond us. The question cut through the chaos with unsettling gentleness. For a split second, my throat tightened with emotion I was not prepared to name. Before I could answer, my ex found his voice again. He called my name sharply across the room, drawing every remaining fragment of attention toward us. The sound of it, no longer intimate but public, made my skin prickle. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached for the stranger's hand without looking at him, my fingers curling around his as if we had rehearsed the gesture in some other life. The contact was electric, born not of affection but of mutual awareness that we were now bound together in this moment whether we liked it or not. The stranger stiffened slightly under my grip, but again he did not pull away. He allowed the illusion to hold. My ex pushed through the thinning crowd, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I met his gaze evenly, surprised by my own composure. The old impulse to explain myself to him stirred briefly, then died just as quickly. I had spent too long justifying my emotions to someone who had decided they no longer mattered. "Doing exactly what you were," I said quietly, my voice steady in a way my hands were not. The words tasted bitter, but they landed with precision. For a moment he looked as if he might argue, but the room did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to the version of the story that had just been rewritten in front of everyone. The woman he had been with said nothing. She stepped back further, watching the exchange with a mixture of discomfort and realization. I wondered briefly if she had known about me from the start. The question lingered unanswered and untethered, lost beneath the weight of what had already erupted. The stranger beside me shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself in a quiet but unmistakably protective way. I hadn't asked for that. I hadn't earned it either. Yet there it was, offered without transaction. The gesture startled me more than the kiss itself had. I felt something in my chest crack, not from pain this time, but from an unfamiliar sense of being supported when I had expected to stand alone. The tension in the room finally fractured as multiple conversations began at once, people whispering rapidly to each other, eyes darting between the three of us as if trying to decide which version of events would become the dominant one. My ex stared at me for another long moment, then turned abruptly and stormed away, the woman hurrying after him without a backward glance. The small crowd slowly dispersed, appetite for spectacle satisfied. I stood there for several seconds longer, the static of adrenaline still buzzing in my veins. Only when the room returned to something like normal did I release the stranger's hand, my fingers tingling as if they had touched a wire instead of flesh. "I didn't mean to drag you into that," I said finally, my voice softer now that the worst had passed. He smiled faintly, not with amusement but with acknowledgement. "Life tends to drag people in without asking," he replied. There was no accusation in his tone. Only observation. He gestured lightly toward the stool I had just abandoned. "Do you want to sit?" The normalcy of the question felt surreal against the chaos that had unfolded minutes earlier. I hesitated, then nodded. We sat side by side in silence for a moment, the aftermath settling uncomfortably between us like heat after a storm. My hands were still shaking when he gently slid a fresh glass of water toward me. "You look like you could use this more than whatever's in that drink," he said. I laughed weakly despite myself, grateful for the grounding shift in energy. I took a sip, letting the cold liquid anchor me back into my body. Only then did the scale of what I had done truly press down on me. I had kissed a stranger in public out of impulse, heartbreak, and defiance. I had wielded that kiss as a weapon. And now I sat beside the very person I had used as a symbol of revenge without consent. The weight of that realization settled heavily on my shoulders. "I'm sorry," I said again, more sincerely this time. "You didn't deserve to be pulled into my mess." He regarded me for a moment before answering. "Maybe not," he said carefully. But I chose not to step away. There was something in that response that unsettled me, not because it was flirtatious but because it was honest. He hadn't been trapped. He had assessed the moment and participated anyway. That knowledge complicated everything. I glanced toward the door where my ex had disappeared, a dull ache blooming beneath the surface of my earlier defiance. The revenge had landed. The consequences, however, were only beginning to take shape. We talked briefly, cautiously, exchanging only fragments of information that floated safely on the surface. First names, vague professions, polite humor stitched through the awkwardness left behind by the spectacle we had just created. Beneath it all, a quiet current pulsed, curiosity intertwined with unease. I did not ask him why he had stayed when common sense might have urged him to stand. He did not ask me for details of the betrayal I had just exposed. We orbited the truth without touching it, two strangers bound by a moment neither of us fully understood yet. When I finally stood to leave, the night had shifted into something cooler and quieter outside. The stranger walked me to the door without ceremony. "Take care of yourself," he said simply. There was no promise in his words. No implication of seeing each other again. Just acknowledgement of what we had shared, however briefly and strangely. I nodded and stepped into the night alone, my heart still racing with the echo of everything that had unfolded inside. It wasn't until I reached my car that the last truth struck me with full force. I had not just kissed a stranger to hurt my ex. I had crossed a line whose consequences I could not yet see. And for the first time since the betrayal, fear finally rivaled anger in my chest. Not fear of what I had lost, but fear of what I had just set into motion without knowing who he truly was. The morning after the kiss arrived far too quickly, heavy with the kind of quiet that settles over a life just before it changes again. I barely slept, drifting in and out of shallow dreams where the stranger's face blurred into my ex's and back again, my subconscious unable to decide which version of the night felt more real. When my alarm rang, I lay still for several minutes staring at the ceiling, my pulse already racing with the familiar ache of heartbreak mixed with the unfamiliar weight of fear. The humiliation from the lounge still burned beneath my skin, but alongside it pulsed something new and restless. A sense that I had broken the fragile boundary between impulse and consequence, and that the cost of that break had yet to reveal itself. Getting ready for work felt mechanical, as if my hands were moving through rehearsed motions while my mind lagged behind, trying to brace itself for a routine that no longer felt predictable. I chose my clothes carefully without knowing why, avoiding anything that felt too bold, too fragile, too revealing of the storm still churning inside me. My reflection in the mirror looked like someone else's, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, lips pressed into a practiced neutrality that wasn't quite believable even to me. I whispered a quiet promise to myself that whatever happened that day, I would keep my private humiliation from infecting my professional dignity. Work at least would remain untouched by the chaos of my personal life. The commute passed in a blur of traffic lights and idle radio chatter that barely registered. I replayed the stranger's voice in my head, his calm question, "Are you okay?" cutting through everything with unsettling clarity. The memory of his hand holding mine at the bar rose unexpectedly, not as comfort but as awareness. I had used that moment as armor without knowing whose shield I had picked up. By the time I pulled into the company parking lot, the unease had settled into my chest like a warning bell I could no longer mute. Inside the building, the atmosphere felt charged in a way I hadn't noticed before. Co-workers moved with quiet urgency, whispers trailing through hallways as people gathered near the conference rooms. There was an unfamiliar tension in the air, the kind that usually accompanied major organizational shifts or executive announcements. I assumed it had something to do with quarterly results or restructuring rumors. Nothing that should have touched me personally. I nodded politely at familiar faces, exchanged a few distracted greetings and made my way to my desk, still cocooned in the illusion that last night's disaster belonged entirely outside these walls. Before I could even log into my computer, an email notification flashed across my screen. Mandatory all-staff meeting, boardroom. Immediate attendance required. My stomach tightened. Messages like that never arrived without wait. Around me, chairs scraped against the floor as people rose almost in unison, their expressions tinged with curiosity and apprehension. I followed the current of employees toward the boardroom, the steady tapping of heels and murmur of speculation vibrating through the corridor. It never once occurred to me that the stranger from the night before was about to step back into my life in the most irreversible way imaginable. The boardroom doors were already open when we arrived. Senior executives stood near the long glass table, their expressions unusually guarded. I slipped into a seat near the middle, heart thudding softly for reasons I couldn't quite name. The room filled quickly, every chair occupied by murmuring bodies and impatient anticipation. I glanced toward the head of the table out of habit and froze. He stood there. Not seated. Not observing from a corner. Standing at the head of the table with quiet authority, hands resting lightly on the polished glass as he spoke in low, measured tones to the senior leadership beside him. The same stranger whose lips mine had touched hours earlier now occupied a space that radiated control and consequence. His posture was the same as it had been at the bar, steady, contained, but here, it carried undeniable command. My breath caught so violently that for a second the room seemed to tilt. Heat rushed into my face as reality collided with memory in brutal clarity. This wasn't coincidence. This was collision. I felt the blood drain from my face as recognition fully settled in. The suit he wore now was tailored and deliberate, not casual like the jacket he'd had on at the lounge. His expression was composed, professional, stripped of the quiet curiosity that had softened his features the night before. Yet when his eyes swept the room and landed on me just for a fraction of a second, something flickered, recognition restrained, buried beneath discipline. My hands trembled beneath the table as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. The stranger I had impulsively used as a symbol of revenge now stood in the most powerful position in my professional world. The room fell silent as the Currencio cleared his throat and gestured toward him. "Everyone, I'd like to introduce our new Chief Executive Officer," he said. Effective immediately. Applause erupted, cautious but persistent, the sound crashing against my senses like surf against stone. I barely heard the rest of the introduction, the impressive resume, the strategic acquisitions, the global experience. All I could see was the curve of his jaw as he nodded politely, accepting the role with practiced ease. My mind screamed with disbelief while my body remained frozen in place, heat and cold warring beneath my skin. When the applause faded, he stepped forward to speak. His voice was the same as it had been the night before, calm, controlled, but now every word carried institutional weight. He spoke about vision, accountability, growth. About building trust within the organization. Each phrase struck me with surreal irony, as if the universe itself were narrating a private joke at my expense. I wondered if anyone else could see the silent earthquake shaking my composure or if it was contained entirely within me. I kept my eyes fixed on my folded hands, terrified that meeting his gaze too long would expose the secret we now shared to the entire room. As the meeting progressed, I felt suspended inside my own body, present and absent all at once. I registered nods, murmurs of approval, the polite rhythm of corporate engagement, but none of it felt real. The only thing that felt real was the memory of how his hand had felt in mine, how his breath had stuttered when I kissed him, how close our faces had been beneath dim bar lights. That intimacy, brief and reckless, now echoed violently against the sterile formality of the boardroom. The contrast left me dizzy with unreality. When the meeting finally adjourned, employees rose in scattered clusters, conversations igniting immediately as speculation and excitement rippled outward. I remained seated, my body heavy with shock. I didn't trust my legs to carry me without betraying the tremor inside me. Around me, coworkers buzzed with speculation about the new CEO's leadership style and strategic potential. None of them suspected that I already knew something about him that didn't belong in board reports or performance metrics. None of them carried the weight of that collision between private and professional reality. A shadow fell across the table in front of me. I looked up slowly and met his eyes again. Up close, the change in him was subtle but unmistakable. The approachable stranger had hardened into refined authority without losing the stillness that had first drawn my attention. His gaze was steady, searching, and conflicted in a way that only I could likely interpret. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" he asked quietly, his tone professional enough to invite no suspicion, yet layered with an undercurrent that curled uneasily in my chest. I nodded without trusting my voice and followed him out of the boardroom, the corridor suddenly too bright, too exposed. Every step felt like crossing a fault line. We walked in silence until he reached a small glass-walled conference room and gestured for me to enter first. The door closed softly behind us, sealing us into a private space that pulsed with unspoken tension. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The hum of the building's ventilation filled the silence with artificial calm. Then he exhaled slowly, his composure tightening by degrees. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said at last. The understatement nearly shattered me. My laugh escaped before I could stop it, brittle and humorless. "That makes two of us," I replied. The truth of last night hung between us like an exposed nerve. He studied me carefully, not as a superior evaluating an employee, but as a man confronting a consequence he had not anticipated. What happened last night was unexpected, he continued, and unplanned. His choice of words was deliberate, insulated with caution. But here none of that exists. This space has rules. Boundaries. The implication landed heavily. He was drawing a line even as he acknowledged what had crossed it. I swallowed hard, shame and defiance tangling in my throat. I never meant to involve you in my personal life, I said quietly. You were just there. The words felt inadequate in the face of how profoundly everything had shifted. He gave a faint nod. And now I'm here, he replied. The symmetry of the statement resonated with quiet inevitability. We stood in silence again, the air thick with complications neither of us could yet name. Outside the glass walls, the company moved on unaware, employees returning to desks and meetings, oblivious to the invisible thread now binding their new CEO to an ordinary employee through an extraordinary misstep. Finally, he straightened subtly, reassembling the professional mask with seamless precision. Nothing that happened last night will affect your position here, he said firmly. You will be judged solely on your performance. Do you understand? I nodded, relieved and unsettled all at once. The words were fair. The reality beneath them was anything but simple. As he opened the door and I stepped back into the corridor, I felt the latest ripple of consequence wash over me. The revenge I had wielded blindly now stood at the pinnacle of my professional world, and the ground beneath both my personal and professional life had shifted in ways I could no longer predict. The stranger was no longer a stranger. He was my boss. The days that followed his introduction as CEO unfolded with an eerie precision that made it impossible for me to separate coincidence from calculation. On the surface, everything at work resumed its usual rhythm. Emails, meetings, deadlines, performance reviews. But beneath that calm ran a current of heightened tension that only I seemed to feel in full. Every mention of his name in conversation made my stomach tighten. Every hallway sighting reminded me of the fragile boundary he had drawn in the glass-walled conference room. He honored it outwardly with professional restraint, never acknowledging me beyond neutral nods during broader meetings. And yet, his presence carried a weight I could not ignore, because I knew what no one else did. That authority and intimacy had already brushed too close in a moment neither of us could undo. The first test of that boundary came sooner than I expected. A mid-level strategy review was scheduled by his office, and my department was unexpectedly asked to present. My supervisor delivered the request with visible surprise, as if the new CEO's interest in our modest team was entirely unanticipated. As I prepared the presentation, my hands shook with a tension that had nothing to do with work itself. I rehearsed my slides obsessively, determined not to give anyone, not him, not my ex, not fate itself, any reason to reinterpret my competence through the lens of that night. This was no longer just about dignity. It was about survival in a space where my credibility now felt dangerously exposed to forces I couldn't openly acknowledge. When the day arrived, the boardroom felt colder than usual, its glass surfaces reflecting more than just fluorescent light. He sat at the head of the table with composed authority, his expression unreadable as teams filtered in to take their places. When my turn came to present, I stood with my spine straight and my voice firm despite the thunder of my heart beneath my ribs. He watched without interruption, his gaze analytical, detached, and entirely professional. Each question he asked was precise, focused solely on performance metrics and strategic clarity. Not once did I detect any hint of the man who had stood beside me at the bar in quiet concern. The contrast was surgical. I left that meeting shaken, not because he had overstepped but because he hadn't, and the discipline required to maintain that division unsettled me more than negligence ever could. Outside the conference room, whispered speculation rippled through the office. Colleagues spoke in cautious tones about his leadership style, how attentive he was to detail, how swiftly he grasped departmental weaknesses, how he seemed to see patterns others had overlooked for years. He earned quiet respect at an accelerated pace, his authority consolidating not through intimidation but through competence that resisted challenge. The admiration, objective and deserved, unsettled me further. The stranger I had once used as an instrument of impulsive revenge now stood firmly at the pinnacle of rational power, insulated from any casual reinterpretation of his motives. That distance made the memory of that night feel almost unreal, as though it belonged to someone else's story instead of mine. Outside the office, my personal life continued to unravel in delayed waves. My ex began calling again, not in humility this time but in agitation. He had seen the press release announcing the new CEO appointment. He had recognized the name. And in that recognition, the weight of what he had witnessed at the lounge finally recalibrated with terrifying clarity. His messages shifted from confusion to accusation overnight. He demanded to know who the man really was. Whether I had planned the encounter. Whether I had set him up. The desperation beneath his rage revealed just how fragile his pride truly was now that he understood the scale of the stranger he had dismissed in public. I did not respond. Silence this time was not avoidance. It was protection. The confrontation I had not sought found me anyway. One evening as I left the office later than planned, my ex was waiting near the building entrance, posture taut with sleepless agitation. The sight of him triggered a surge of dread I hadn't anticipated, my body responding faster than reason could intervene. He stepped forward, blocking my path just enough to force acknowledgement without drawing attention. His eyes were red-rimmed, anger and humiliation blending into a dangerous intensity. He demanded to know how long I had known who the stranger was. The question, so deeply rooted in false assumption, startled me into a cold clarity. I didn't, I told him evenly. I found out the same way you did. The truth, unembellished, did nothing to soothe him. He accused me of manipulation anyway. He insisted no woman simply coincidentally kisses a future CEO in a crowded bar without ulterior motive. His version of events rewrote my shock into strategy because that narrative preserved his sense of control. I watched the distortion take shape in his eyes as he spoke, realizing with sobering clarity that accountability was unreachable for someone who required a villain in order to avoid confronting his own betrayal. I stepped past him without further response, my pulse accelerating as I entered the night air, the echo of his accusations dissolving behind me without direction or pursuit. Inside the corporate walls, the power shift continued with quiet decisiveness. The CEO initiated subtle structural changes, streamlining departments, redefining reporting channels, emphasizing transparency where secrecy had long gone unquestioned. The organization adapted quickly, energized by what felt like long overdue clarity. I found myself working harder than ever, propelled not by fear alone but by a sharpened sense of self-preservation that now intersected with professional ambition. If my personal life had lost its illusion of safety, my work would not lose its integrity alongside it. I would not become a footnote in a narrative that had already cost me too much. Our paths crossed often in passing, always under the gaze of others. When we spoke in meetings, it was exclusively in the language of performance and projection. And yet, on rare occasions when no one else was near, our eyes met with shared recognition of the complication threading between us. There was no warmth in those moments. No longing. Only the quiet awareness of what remained unresolved and unaddressed by necessity rather than denial. Each brief glance felt like a reminder that the boundary we maintained so carefully existed not because the past was irrelevant, but because it was too relevant to risk contamination. The office became a laboratory of emotional restraint. I observed him as others did, measuring his leadership through outcomes rather than impressions. I learned the rhythm of his decision-making, the patterns of his attention. And in that observation something unexpected emerged, respect untainted by sentiment. The stranger I had kissed in a moment of defiance had not disappeared entirely. But neither had he intruded upon the world where he now held authority. The duality unsettled and steadied me at once, a contradiction I did not yet know how to resolve. My ex's realization of what had happened did not quiet him. It amplified him. Rumors began to surface through casual channels. Suggestions that my connection to the CEO was pre-existing, that my position in the company had been artificially secured. The insinuations carried no proof, only the residue of insecurity seeking somewhere to settle. I confronted them not with words but with work. My performance became my shield, my credibility my defense. Over time the whispers found no substance to cling to. Achievement silences rumor more effectively than retaliation ever could. Still the pressure did not ease. The power shift was not just organizational. It was deeply personal. My revenge had not landed where I expected it to. It had propelled me into a landscape of complexity where dominance and vulnerability coexisted in fragile balance. The stranger had become my superior. My ex had become my accuser. And I stood between them, caught not in romance, not in victory but in consequence. The final truth of that phase came to me not in confrontation but in exhaustion. One evening, long after the office had emptied, I found myself alone at my desk staring at the darkened skyline beyond the windows. My reflection stared back faintly from the glass, tired, composed, irrevocably changed. I had kissed a stranger to make a point in a moment of pain. The point had been made. But life does not stop at punctuation. It continues into paragraphs written in quieter ink. And the story was far from finished. The pressure of unresolved consequence has a way of reshaping daily life without ever announcing itself. It does not arrive with impact the way betrayal does, nor with spectacle the way revenge often does. It settles. It merges into breath, into routine, into the subtle tightening of the chest at moments that should feel ordinary. That was how I began to live after the power shift took hold. Externally composed, internally braced. Each morning I entered the building with steadiness I no longer questioned. And each evening I carried home the weight of unspoken intersections between what had happened and what continued to unfold. The stranger was no longer a stranger. My boss was no longer merely an authority figure. He stood as living evidence of a decision I had made in pain that now governed the architecture of my working life. Weeks passed in professional efficiency and private restraint. He did nothing to complicate my position and I did nothing to invite complication. The boundary he drew in that glass-walled room remained intact by mutual discipline, not mutual denial. And yet the tension did not disappear. It matured. It gained texture. Every project review became a test of credibility. Every performance evaluation became an unspoken reassurance that I was evaluated for competence alone. The fairness of his conduct unsettled me more than favoritism ever could have. It stripped away every excuse I might have clung to for misinterpreting my own future within the company. There would be no dramatic collapse, no ethical breach to flee from. If I left, it would be because I chose to, not because circumstances expelled me. Outside of work, my ex continued to unravel in orbit around my silence. His messages grew less frequent but more erratic in intensity, swinging between apology and accusation with increasing volatility. He accused me of orchestrating humiliation. He begged me to explain what I had done to ruin his standing in the eyes of his peers. He framed my refusal to engage as cruelty rather than consequence. I did not respond, not from indifference but from an understanding I had earned the hard way. Explanations offered to those who reshape truth to fit comfort are rarely received as truth at all. My choice to disengage from him was no longer revenge. It was disengagement from a dynamic I had outgrown. The turning point came without spectacle on an afternoon that began like any other. My supervisor informed me that the CEO had requested a one-on-one review with me. The neutrality of the message did nothing to quiet the surge of apprehension beneath my ribs. I walked to his office with professional composure stitched carefully over personal uncertainty, my thoughts shifting between every possible interpretation of what the meeting might entail. When I entered, he gestured for me to sit with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. His expression was composed but not distant. The man who now occupied that office was moving not as a stranger, not as a former accidental participant in my pain, but as someone prepared to acknowledge what had been left suspended between us for far too long. He did not begin with work. That alone signaled the gravity of what was about to be said. He acknowledged that the boundaries he had set remained necessary, and that professionalism would remain absolute regardless of anything discussed. Then he spoke in careful cadence, not as my boss but as the man whose life had intersected violently with mine under circumstances neither of us had chosen. He said that he had not anticipated the collision of identities the way it had occurred. That he continued to respect the separation of that collision from the institution he led. But that respect alone did not dissolve the unresolved truth between us. That a moment of vulnerability, however unintended, had altered perception on both sides. I listened in stillness, unaware that my hands had curled into fists against my lap until he paused and asked gently if I was all right. I told him the truth without ornament, that I had kissed him in pain, not intent, that I had not known who he was, that I had never imagined his presence would follow me into my professional life, and that the consequences of that moment now defined a chapter one did not know how to close. My voice did not tremble as it once would have. It carried the steadiness of someone no longer afraid of hearing herself speak honestly in the aftermath of loss. He did not offer absolution. He did not offer pursuit. He offered clarity. He told me he had no intention of exploiting proximity or circumstance, nor of retreating from the fact that what had happened was real even if brief. He made it unmistakably clear that the institution came first, for him and for me. But within that truth he also acknowledged something else without attempting to touch it prematurely. That attraction born of vulnerability does not vanish simply because it should. Acknowledging that reality without acting upon it was, he said, part of the discipline his position demanded. The weight of his restraint settled over me with unexpected effect. I had braced myself for power to distort the interaction, for authority to lean, if only subtly, toward leverage. Instead he placed accountability where I had once placed impulse. That inversion altered me more deeply than any flirtation ever could have. I realized with quiet force that the power I feared was not external. It had been internal all along. The power to choose what story I would continue staging in my life after the moment of collapse. When the meeting ended, he did not extend an invitation. He did not withdraw into aloofness either. He simply returned to the language of work with unbroken professionalism. The conversation remained closed within the room that had contained it. I left with something I had not expected to carry out with me. Peace that did not require resolution but acknowledgement. Some truths do not demand immediate movement. They demand patience until movement becomes honest rather than reactionary. That night, for the first time since the betrayal, I allowed myself to grieve without performing strength. Not for my ex. Not for the relationship that had already emptied itself of meaning before it ended. I grieved for the version of myself who had reached for spectacle because silence felt unbearable. I grieved for the belief that revenge could restore dignity. It cannot. Dignity is reclaimed not through demonstration but through reorientation. And in that quiet realization, the weight I had been carrying since the lounge finally loosened its grip on my chest. My choice clarified without ceremony. I would remain where I was. I would not flee from a chapter just because it had begun in chaos. Nor would I pursue what was formed in fracture simply because it held unfamiliar heat. The stranger had become my boss through circumstance. My boss had become something more complicated through coincidence. Neither transformation required further distortion to reach meaning. What mattered now was that I decide my life through intention rather than reaction. Months later, the rumors had long since died. My ex had ceased all attempts at contact. The company moved forward under disciplined leadership. And I moved forward under something quieter, self-respect that did not need to announce itself. I had kissed a stranger in front of my cheating ex to prove I would not disappear into humiliation. I did not know then that the real proof would come not from who I touched in anger, but from who I chose not to pursue in the aftermath of power and consequence entangled. The stranger did become my boss. But I became something more enduring than reaction. I became deliberate. If this story moved you, surprised you, or made you think, like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of betrayal, revenge, and unexpected consequences.